Picture this. It's a quiet evening along the Trinity River. The water flows steadily, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. The air is still, almost too still. And then, you see it, something out of place. Something horrifying. A young woman's body, discarded like trash, lying beneath the shadow of the Precinct Line Road bridge. Her life stolen, her story silenced. This isn't fiction. This isn't a movie. This is the chilling reality of a crime that shook Fort Worth, Texas to its core. The man behind this brutal act? He wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in the dark. He was someone no one suspected. Someone who walked among us. But how did he slip through the cracks for so long? And what twisted path led him to this moment? Tonight, we unravel the haunting story of Janeecia Mason, Joseph Aparicio, and the investigation that exposed a killer hiding in plain sight. It was a day like any other in Fort Worth, until it wasn't. On the banks of the Trinity River, beneath the cold, unfeeling steel of the Precinct Line Road bridge, a gruesome discovery was made. Janeecia Mason, a 19-year-old with her whole life ahead of her, was found lifeless, her body abandoned like an afterthought. The scene was surreal, almost cinematic in its horror. The water lapped gently at the shore, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded. The community was stunned. Who could do such a thing? And why? The initial investigation yielded more questions than answers. There were no witnesses, no obvious suspects, just a young woman's body and a growing sense of dread. But as the days turned into weeks, detectives began to piece together a puzzle that would lead them to a man no one saw coming: Joseph Aparicio. Aparicio wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in the alleys. He was someone who blended into the fabric of everyday life. But beneath that ordinary exterior lay a darkness few could comprehend. And as the investigation deepened, it became clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a calculated, cold-blooded crime, one that would reveal shocking twists and leave investigators questioning just how far Aparicio's reach extended. Imagine this: you're face to face with someone you suspect is a killer. Your heart is racing, your mind is spinning. What do? Do you confront them, risking everything? Or do you run, hoping to live another day? What would you do in that moment? Let me know in the comments below. Your answer might surprise you. Before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. By joining our community, you'll be the first to know whenever we share a new crime story that sheds light on the darkest corners of humanity. These stories are not just about tragedy, they're about justice, awareness, and the power of speaking up. Don't miss out. Subscribe now, and let's uncover the truth together. Janeecia Mason was only 19 years old when her life was brutally cut short. But to reduce her story to just a victim of a crime would be a disservice to who she truly was. Janeecia was a young woman with dreams, aspirations, and a personality that left an impression on everyone she met. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's loved one. Her life, though tragically short, was filled with moments of joy, struggle, and resilience. Growing up in Fort Worth, Janeecia faced challenges that many of us can't even imagine. Life wasn't always kind to her, and like many young women in similar circumstances, she found herself drawn into the world of sex work. It's easy to judge, to stigmatize, to dismiss. But behind every choice lies a story of survival, of trying to make ends meet in a world that often feels like it's stacked against you. Janeecia was no different. She was doing what she could to get by, to carve out a life for herself in a system that often fails the most vulnerable. But Janeecia was more than her profession. She was a vibrant soul who loved music, who dreamed of a better future, and who had a smile that could light up a room. Her family remembers her as someone who was fiercely loyal, who cared deeply for those she loved, and who never stopped fighting for a chance at a better life. When Janeecia's body was discovered on the banks of the Trinity River, her family's world shattered. The pain of losing a child, a sister, a friend, it's a pain that never truly goes away. Her mother, in particular, became a voice for justice, refusing to let Janeecia's story be forgotten. She fought tirelessly to ensure that her daughter's killer was brought to justice, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. But Janeecia's story doesn't end with her death. In fact, it was just the beginning of a chilling investigation that would uncover more than anyone bargained for. As detectives began to piece together the final moments of her life, they would uncover a web of secrets, lies, and a darkness that extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Janeecia's death was a tragedy, but it was also a catalyst. It set off a chain of events that would lead investigators down a path they never expected. A path that would reveal not just one killer, but the possibility of others who had fallen victim to the same darkness. The question wasn't just who killed Janeecia Mason, it was why. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the answers were far more sinister than anyone could have anticipated. The Trinity River is a place of natural beauty, a serene escape for many in Fort Worth. But on the day Janeecia Mason's body was discovered, the riverbank became a scene of unspeakable horror. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with silence, as if the world itself is holding its breath. A passerby out for an early walk noticed something out of place, a shape that didn't belong. As they moved closer, the grim reality set in. A young woman's body, partially concealed, lay motionless beneath the shadow of the Precinct Line Road bridge. The call to 911 set off a chain of events that would bring the quiet riverbank to life in the most unsettling way. Police cars arrived, their sirens slicing through the stillness. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, creating a stark contrast against the natural backdrop. Forensic teams moved in, their faces grim as they began the painstaking process of documenting the scene. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every footprint was scrutinized. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the discovery pressing down on everyone present. But despite their meticulous efforts, the scene offered few answers. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no murder weapon left behind, no clear indication of how Janeecia had ended up there. The lack of clues was frustrating to say the least. Investigators were left with more questions than answers. Who was she? How did she get here? And most importantly, who did this to her? The community was on edge. Rumors spread like wildfire, each one more unsettling than the last. Was this a random act of violence or something more calculated? Was the killer still out there, watching, waiting to strike again? The uncertainty was paralyzing, and the pressure on law enforcement to find answers was immense. Just when it seemed like the case might go cold, a breakthrough emerged, one that would change everything. Forensic analysts discovered DNA evidence at the scene, a tiny but crucial clue that would become the key to unlocking the mystery. DNA is often called the silent witness, and in this case, it spoke volumes. The sample was processed, entered into databases and cross-referenced with known offenders. And then a match. Joseph Aparicio. A name that would soon send shockwaves through the investigation. But this wasn't just a simple case of matching DNA to a suspect. As detectives dug deeper, they began to uncover something even more disturbing. Aparicio's DNA wasn't just linked to Janeecia's murder, it was connected to other unsolved cases. Could this be the work of a serial offender? Was Janeecia just one of many? The implications were chilling, and the investigation took on a new urgency. The discovery of DNA evidence was a turning point, but it also raised questions. How reliable is DNA alone in securing a conviction? Should there always be additional proof to ensure justice is served? It's a debate that continues to this day, and one that brings us to our next engagement question. Do you think DNA evidence is enough to convict someone, or should there always be additional proof? Is DNA the ultimate smoking gun, or can it sometimes lead to wrongful convictions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is a topic that sparks a lot of debate, and we want to hear your perspective. Joseph Aparicio wasn't the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. He wasn't a notorious criminal with a long rap sheet, nor was he someone who drew attention to himself. To his neighbors, co-workers, and even acquaintances, he was just an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But beneath that unassuming exterior lurked a darkness that few could have imagined. Aparicio grew up in Fort Worth, a city he knew like the back of his hand. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and blended into the fabric of everyday life. There was nothing about him that screamed killer. No red flags, no warning signs, at least none that were obvious. But as investigators would soon discover, Aparicio was a master of deception. He knew how to fly under the radar, how to avoid suspicion, and how to keep his secrets buried. For years, Aparicio managed to evade the kind of scrutiny that might have exposed his true nature. He moved through life like a ghost, leaving little trace of his darker impulses. But all of that changed when forensic evidence linked him to Janeecia Mason's murder. Suddenly, the man who had spent his life hiding in plain sight was thrust into the spotlight, and the revelations that followed would send shockwaves through the community. The breakthrough in the case came when DNA evidence collected from the crime scene was matched to Aparicio. It was a moment of both triumph and dread for investigators. Triumph because they finally had a suspect. Dread because they knew this was just the beginning of a much larger puzzle. Detectives began piecing together Aparicio's movements in the days leading up to Janeecia's murder. Witnesses came forward, some reluctantly, others eager to help. They painted a picture of a man who was calm, calculated, and eerily composed. There were no outbursts, no obvious signs of guilt, just a quiet, almost unsettling normalcy. But the evidence against him was mounting. Surveillance footage placed him near the Trinity River around the time of the murder. Phone records revealed suspicious activity. And then there was the DNA, undeniable, irrefutable proof that tied him to the crime. The moment of his arrest was chilling. Aparicio didn't resist, didn't protest. He was almost eerily calm, as if he had been expecting this day to come. When questioned, he gave vague answers, never fully admitting to the crime but never outright denying it either. It was as if he was playing a game, testing the limits of what he could get away with. But the most disturbing part? Investigators began to suspect that Janeecia's murder wasn't an isolated incident. Aparicio's DNA was linked to other unsolved cases, raising the terrifying possibility that he had been operating in the shadows for years. How many others had fallen victim to his darkness? And how had he managed to evade capture for so long? But here's the twist. Aparicio wasn't just connected to Janeecia's murder. Investigators began to suspect he might be involved in other unsolved cases. What else was he hiding? Was Janeecia just one of many? The answers to these questions would lead investigators down a path darker than anyone could have imagined. And as the truth began to unravel, one thing became painfully clear. Joseph Aparicio was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The trial of Joseph Aparicio was anything but ordinary. From the moment the proceedings began, the courtroom was charged with an almost palpable tension. Every word, every piece of evidence, every reaction was scrutinized. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. For Janeecia Mason's family, it was a chance to see justice served. For the community, it was a moment to confront the darkness that had been lurking in their midst. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of irrefutable evidence. The DNA match was the centerpiece, a scientific thread that tied Aparicio directly to the crime. Forensic experts took the stand, explaining in meticulous detail how the evidence had been collected, analyzed, and matched to the defendant. It was a masterclass in modern investigative techniques, and it left little room for doubt. But the most gripping moments came from Janeecia's family. Her mother took the stand, her voice trembling with grief and anger as she spoke about her daughter. She described Janeecia as a vibrant, loving young woman whose life had been stolen far too soon. Her testimony was raw, emotional, and deeply moving, a stark reminder that behind every crime statistic is a human being with a story, a family, and a future that was brutally cut short. Aparicio, for his part, remained eerily calm throughout the trial. He showed little emotion even as the evidence against him mounted. When it came time for him to speak, he shocked the courtroom by entering a guilty plea. There was no grand confession, no dramatic breakdown, just a quiet admission of guilt that left everyone wondering what was going through his mind. The judge's sentencing was swift and decisive. Aparicio was handed a life sentence, ensuring that he would never walk free again. For Janeecia's family, it was a moment of closure, but also a bittersweet victory. No amount of justice could bring her back, but at least they could take solace in knowing that her killer would never harm anyone else. The trial may have ended, but the impact of the case reverberated far beyond the courtroom. For the Fort Worth community, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. People began to look at their neighbors, their co-workers, even their friends with a newfound wariness. Could someone they knew be capable of such a crime? It was a question that lingered in the air, unspoken but ever present. For law enforcement, the case was a turning point. The success of the investigation hinged on the power of forensic science, particularly DNA evidence. It underscored the importance of investing in cutting-edge technology and training for investigators. But it also raised questions about how many other cold cases could be solved with the same tools. Was Aparicio responsible for more crimes? Investigators began re-examining unsolved cases, looking for connections that might have been missed. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities. Janeecia Mason was a sex worker, a profession often stigmatized and overlooked. Her murder highlighted the dangers faced by those in similar circumstances and the need for greater protections and resources. Advocates used her story to push for change, ensuring that her death was not in vain. As the years passed, the Trinity River returned to its tranquil state, but the memory of Janeecia Mason remained. Her story became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, justice can prevail. And while the scars of her loss will never fully heal, her legacy lives on in the fight for a safer, more just world. As we come to the end of this harrowing tale, it's important to reflect on the key moments that define this case. It began with the tragic discovery of Janeecia Mason's body on the banks of the Trinity River, a young woman whose life was cut short in the most brutal way. Through the tireless efforts of investigators, the puzzle pieces began to come together, leading them to Joseph Aparicio, a man whose ordinary exterior hid a deeply sinister nature. The trial was a watershed moment, not just for Janeecia's family, but for the entire community. It showcased the power of forensic science, the resilience of those fighting for justice, and the importance of never giving up, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Aparicio's guilty plea and life sentence brought a measure of closure, but it also opened the door to more questions. Was Janeecia his only victim? Or were there others whose stories remain untold? Above all, this case reminds us that Janeecia Mason was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams and aspirations. Her life mattered, and her story deserves to be remembered. It's a stark reminder that behind every crime statistic is a human being, a life that was lived, loved, and lost far too soon. This case leaves us with so many questions. Do you think there are more victims out there waiting for justice? And what do you think drives someone to commit such a brutal crime? Is it nature, nurture, or something else entirely? Let's discuss in the comments. Your thoughts and theories could spark a fascinating conversation. If this story gripped you as much as it gripped us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Every like and share helps us bring more of these important stories to light. And if you have a case you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of darkness, and into the light of justice. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, the truth is always worth seeking.